Fisherman of Reddit, what is the strangest thing you have pulled out of the water? I was fishing with my dad off the coast of Mallorca in Spain when I was about 15. It was really warm and we weren't catching anything much, so we got some snorkels and went for a swim around to see if we could see anything interesting. It was only about 20 feet deep. Around these cave-like rocks I spotted what looked like a dead body. I started trying to dive down, but I'm not a super strong swimmer, so when I would get to about 10 feet away from it I would have to come back up for air. Eventually my dad gets to it and I was diving and watching and diving and watching, thinking frick, and he was wriggling a rock trying to free it. It starts to float towards the surface and my dad follows. Right in front of my face a half-melted slimy life-size plastic Santa bobs out of the water. Weird thing is I'm not sure Spanish people even really have Santa as part of their Christmas decorations. I'm glad I was in the sea because I'm pretty sure I peed my pants. My dad thought it was hilarious. He put melty dead guy Santa into the boat to show my mom. About a week later I woke up and it was in my bed. Good old troll dad. A few years back I went catfishing at a river not far from my house. I was dropping shad on an egg sinker a few feet deep when I got a very weak hit. I set the hook and started reeling in and whatever was on the other end was heavy, but not fighting, like at all. I saw the tail rise out of the water a few times, so I knew it was a fish, but the thing just lay there. When I landed it I found out just how goddamn tough catfish are. Some shit kiker had caught this fish before, cut off the fillets and released it back into the river. This fish had been stripped of all muscle, but was fully healed, still swimming and even hunting. I took a rock and put it out of its misery, but that poor fish was tough. R.I.P. Mr. Wiggles. I guess it was more the experience that was weird, but I caught a small walleye and was actually lifting it out of the water when a huge northern pike jumped in out of the water and engulfed the walleye, before diving back into the lake. When we cut it open later, there was a pristine fully intact walleye sitting in its belly. Awesome experience. I need to get back to the Midwest. I miss walleye. My brother and I were fishing in a lake last year and we pulled a hat with a fishing license on it out of the water. It was an out-of-state license but it had the guy's name and location. So we got on Facebook, messaged him and gave him his slimy drenched hat back. I knew a guy that lost his Timex during a fishing trip. The next year, he was in the same stream and reeled it in. Still working. When I was a kid I went fishing with my grandpa, and while we were fishing he dropped a pole into the water and it quickly sank to the bottom. He says I want my pole back, threw a line in and caught his fishing pole. 10-year-old me was amazed. Crap, 22-year-old me is still amazed. I've come to realize that I will never be as incredibly manly as my dad or grandpa. At this point, I'd have to go frickin' Walden to be half as manly as them. Catching your lost fishing pole with a fishing pole is pretty dang manly. When I was a kid my dad took me fishing. To my surprise I caught a fish but it was too small to keep. He told me to throw it back, so being a dumb 8-year-old I threw it back as hard as I could. Unfortunately I lack any kind of hand-eye coordination whatsoever and the poor fish ended up hitting the side of a nearby tree and getting stuck. I was horrified. My father was disappointed. Picturing this is beyond hilarious. Well, not out of the water, but a bat. I was fly fishing at dusk and a bat got tangled in my backcast. Thankfully he did not hook himself and was able to crawl out of the tangle after hitting the ground. Ha. Caught a seagull casting in broad daylight. Got him just right in the wing so it couldn't fly straight. Luckily there was a park ranger there who witnessed the whole thing. He spent 2 hours reeling it in and giving it slack when it resisted as to not kill or permanently damage the bird. Finally gets it in, gets the hook out, and the seagull flies away. We stopped fishing after that. My aunt once caught a small fish. What was strange was how she caught it. She reeled it out of the water with the hook in its anus. Martis Lake, Ontario, was trolling for walleye, and no joke, snagged something. I brought it up, and it was a boot. Not just any boot, but an old boot, like ancient, wooden sole, leather, looked like it was from the Civil War. I think that the near freezing spring lake preserved it. Keep in mind this is a lake that even today you cannot get to except by seaplane, so this thing was probably a pioneer's boot who fell into the water and drowned. Probably just a shoe some hipster lost the previous day. My cousin left his line in the Ohio River overnight with hopes of something latching onto the hook. He went down to check the line in the morning and a female human body had gotten tangled in his line near the bank. I would have crapped my pants. Yeah, seems like the Ohio River. We went fishing while on vacation and my mom's fishing line got caught on someone else's and she yelled, "Is anyone over there hung?" And all the guys on the other side of the boat with no hesitation said yep. Her face got immediately red. I was fishing a city park for bass, and I felt something weird on the line, often a fish moving in a direction you don't expect, so I set the hook and it was fish on. I fought that fish and it felt like it kept thrashing its head and diving for the bottom. Was ready for a big fish, and when I pulled it out of the water it was a lovingly worn strap-on dildo with the straps intact. TLDR, caught a strap-on dildo once. Not my story, but a friend of mine was fishing a lake for bass that often had Mexican migrants fishing and drinking around it as well. He thought he had snagged a log one day and was pulling it in to get his lure back. It wasn't a log, it was the body of a dead migrant and his jig was hooked into the flesh of his stomach where it had ripped a hole. TLDR, friend caught a body. I have a good one. One day I was fishing with my dad and my brother, and my dad caught a catfish. When we go fishing we usually only catch bluegill and the occasional turtle, so we were excited. It was too small to keep though, so my dad starts to take the hook out. Now keep in mind you can't release catfish by holding them in your hand like normal fish. They'll slice your hand open. So my dad held it under his boot and took it out. This entire time he's working the hook out though this fish keeps repeating. A flag. Sounded exactly like the duck from the commercial, only it sounded angry. We started laughing a bit at first, only it started saying it louder and faster, like some sort of ancient catfish curse. My dad got the hook out though and threw it back, but still was weird. TLDR, caught a magic talking catfish that cursed us with an insurance gimmick. Oh yeah, catfish can be real chatterboxes. They usually squeak and grumble at me. A moray eel scared the crap out of me. They're freaking ugly and they're oddly squishy and soft, probably so they can fit between the rocks. Also I caught a yellowtail, hamachi anyone, off of the Ventura coast in late November, which is very uncommon, when I was 7 years old. To this day, it's the biggest fish I've ever caught. When a weird squishy eel hits your boot covered heel, that's a moray. I caught a fold up chair once when I was younger. I had my hook at the bottom on the lake cause I wanted some catfish, but I caught something heavy and pulled up a chair, and I was sure that there was a body that fell in with the chair, but no such luck. TLDR, a chair. The weirdest thing I've ever hooked onto isn't that weird. It was just a giant snapping turtle. However, I know a guy that pulled out a body of an old lady out of a reservoir. The cops speculated that she had wandered out of her house in the winter, hopped up on old lady medication, and made her way out to the reservoir, where she eventually fell through the ice and died. When the ice melted and my buddy started fishing there, he just happened to hook onto the body. I can't imagine that though, thinking you have a big fish, and all of a sudden, old lady. Frick that. Not out of the water, but my dad is an avid fly fisher, and as he was casting, the fly got caught on a branch. He tugged at it a few times, but it didn't come free, so he yanked it real hard as he looked back and got a fish hook right in his eye. Good news though, he had surgery right away and his eye and vision is perfectly fine. Wear eye protection, fellow fishermen. I just clutched my face and eyes in horror. I was deep sea fishing in the Pacific for the first time and caught a fish, forget what kind, but 18 inches long. The captain quickly comes over, puts his hand down the mouth, and says quickly, "Eat this to gain the luck of the ocean," as he pulled out the still beating heart. Yep, I ate it. My dad's told me this is a relatively common phenomenon among charter captains, along with throwing you overboard on your first marlin. When I was a weedy little kid I went on a chartered sea fishing trip in Wales. There were a dozen or so people on the trip, and the guy running things was kind of a W. Yelled a lot, wasn't very patient. I'd already gotten some tackle caught in someone else's line, and he came over to me when I was struggling with my fishing rod. He rolled his eyes, took it off me and set about getting me out from under a rock. He then reeled in a 12-pound pollock that was half my size. The rest of the boat fixed their rods and came over, told me they call those grunters and that you rarely ever see one. TL. DR. Went to sea with a W. Dual tackle with a stranger. Struggled with my stiff rod. And ended up taking a huge grunter while a dozen people watched. They call those grunters, and that you rarely ever see one. I had one of those in my bathroom this morning, but I had to release him. I've been fishing my entire life and caught lots of peculiar stuff. Eel, octopus, a shark by its dong, and all kinds of weird bottom fish. Two really stand out though. When I was a kid, me and my old man caught an otter while seining. Seining is basically like taking a volleyball net, flipping it upside down, and walking through the water with one guy on each end. Then you drag it up on shore. The otter was a juvenile and our two dogs were swimming around playing with this thing. It would float in the water until one of the dogs got too close. Then he'd dive under and swim away. He'd pop up right behind the dog and make a loud chuffing sound. The dogs would go back crap. They played like this for about 15 minutes while we dragged the seine. One of the dogs ended up chasing him into the seine and we dragged it up on shore. The otter was not amused. This thing went ballistic, thrashing and biting. Dad held the dogs and told me to let it out. I was scared to death. I flipped the net open and the thing took a run at me. I ate crap trying to get away from it and it beelined for the water. No harm done. I got older and the old man got a boat we could take offshore. We were trolling when a flock of gannets came through and started diving on our baits. They do this periodically and there's not a lot you can do. They never get hooked. Until one did. Gannets are giant seabirds. They can have a 5-6 foot wingspan and are scary as heck up close. He hooked himself in the wing somehow and set the hook trying to fly away. I grabbed the rod and flew this bird like a kite. He'd try to fly and pinwheel into the ocean. I dragged him as fast as I could so we wouldn't drown him or hurt him any worse than he already was. I got him up next to the boat and the old man tossed a towel on him and wrapped him up. We covered his head and everything but the hooked wing so he couldn't bite us, and I held the bird while the old man dehooked him. The wing was fine. Not broken and just had a little hole in it from the hook. The old man got on the far side of the boat and told me to let it go. This bird was freaking huge. My game plan was to toss it away from me over the water and hold onto the towel. I executed my plan and this giant goddamn bird wheeled around and bit the crap out my outstretched hand. My dad was rolling around, he was laughing so hard. TL doctor. Caught and released an otter without incident. Caught a bird and got bitten. Birds are cocksuckers. First time fishing in Minnesota using tiny spinner lure and 4 pounds test. Fishing for crappies. In a canoe. Thought hook had gotten caught up on a log, but the log rose up and it was a 42 inches muskie. I was terrified and said to the other guy in the canoe, "Holy crap, I caught an alligator." The thing dragged the canoe around for a half hour before we got it up. The 3.5 fish thrashed around in the canoe until it broke the line and literally jumped out of the boat. Biggest adrenaline rush I've ever had fishing. Not me but my father. While out fishing at night with friends, they spotted something floating in the water. Upon closer inspection it turned out to be a dead body. They managed to pull it aboard by hooking a rope around the upper torso and arms. Radioed the Coast Guard and they were met halfway. It turned out that the body was a US Navy sailor who was lost overboard in a stormy training exercise sometime before. I am unsure how long the body was in the water. This happened a while back. As a child I went fishing off of a pier in Florida. A woman in her 40s was reeling in something huge. As it got closer to the water, she needed 3 men to hold onto the pole with her. She was reeling in a manta ray. Its wingspan was easily 15-20 feet across. It was amazing. A real sea monster. I've lived in Florida almost my whole life, and I've been fishing 334563225677644 times. Stingrays are the only thing I've ever freaking caught. About 3 years ago, me and my dad were trolling for tuna about 30 miles off of Atlantic City, NJ, and having no luck. When you troll, you run the boat and let the lines run out to a reasonable distance and then just drive around slowly. There's patterns you can do and different methods, but I won't bore you with the details. Anyway, we weren't catching anything until one of the reels goes off, screaming as it would if a big fish took it. My dad grabs the tuna belt and starts fighting this fish, and let me tell you, it was tough. Probably a half-hour long fight. Finally get it to the surface and I go to gaff it, expecting it to be a tuna wahoo mahi, and I kid you not, It's 3 blankets tied together that are just so waterlogged it was so hard to pull them up. My dad actually spent over a half hour fighting 3 wet blankets. We still laugh about it to this day, and whenever anything bites my dad will yell blanket on. TLDR. I painstakingly typed this out on an iPhone, so read it you suckers. You know how these fish stories go. It was probably only 2 wet blankets. As a little girl, my granddad used to take me fishing. He had all kinds of lures, bits and bobs, you know the drill. We'd go out early in the morning and stay until we got hungry. We would bring the fish home and I'd watch him skin them. Grandma would cook them for dinner and the leftovers would be buried under the sunflowers. My grandfather, like much of the family, took every opportunity to tell a good story. When he'd skin the base, he would look at me, wink, and say that if the devil was in the fish, it would keep moving after it was dead. Sure enough, he'd skin them, gut them, take all the meat from their bones, and the fish would still open and close their jaws. Open and close. Open and close. Of course, now I know it's natural, but back then, TLDR, the devil possesses fishies. I prefer to read your opening line as if you were stating your grandfather was a little girl. Another fishing pole. The only reason it stood out was because another person was there to give the background. Apparently a man had shown up to fish the day before with a fancy rod made in Japan, but he couldn't quite work it. After some frustration, the guy tossed it into the lake and went home. There was an old man that came there almost every day. He told the story and I got a rod worth a few $100s. I was reeling in a mackerel off of St. Augustine, and when I reached in to pull it out of the water, a barracuda came and took the whole body. All I got was the bleeding fish head. Also, my dad once caught a gun in a lake on an Air Force base. I was fishing with my dad, and as I was reeling something in, it got harder to pull. All of a sudden, a huge northern pike ended up gobbling down a smaller fish that was caught on my line. Bonus. We were fishing on our lake up in northern Michigan with my uncle, who is a DNR officer, Department of Natural Resources. This is relevant. When we finished for the day, we pulled up the anchor, and there was a lot of resistance to it. With everyone working together, we finally pulled it up, and it was hooked on a really thick insulated cable. We are on a pretty small lake, and my uncle had absolutely no explanation for the cable. All he could say is there is no reason why that should be here. Kinda weird. My cousin caught irregular trout and pulled it halfway out of the water, and then all of a sudden this huge trout came and chomped down on the fish and she got both of them. The first time I went fishing I was about 5 years old, and my brother, who was 9, had a few years of experience ahead of me when it came to fishing. He told me to stand in the pond and wait for him to throw me the hook, which I should throw at the fishies. He threw me the hook, which I caught, in my hand. He then reeled the hook and ripped a gash in my hand. The worst part of the story is that we were in a fishing competition for 5 12-year-olds. While he reeled the line in, with my skin on it, he caught an 18-pound catfish. He won the tournament and I had to get stitches. This story ends with you becoming a successful businessman and using your self-made millions to hire a guy to pee on your brother every morning. This didn't happen to me, but happened to a family friend. In the 60s, him and a few friends spent an entire weekend out fishing and barely caught anything worth mentioning, when all of a sudden one of them felt a huge bite. He started pulling and slowly, out of the water, emerged a human hand, followed by an arm, then a shoulder, until he had fully pulled out a dead body. Totally true. It was a suicide victim. When the Guarderie arrived, Irish police, they searched the body, and in his jacket pocket, sealed in a plastic bag, was £1,000, which back then was the equivalent of finding about 50k. Needless to say, they were they didn't search the body themselves. Genuinely true story. TLDR. Friend caught a dead body. Lots of money too. Not necessarily strange if you fish frequently, but some of my notables. A complete rod and reel. Alligator snapping turtle. It was rather cross. Cables allow the episode of Lost when the cable is found on the beach. Shredded life jacket. When I was a kid fishing in the local man-made lake in Virginia, Texas, I got super tripped out when my line floated towards the wooden ledge at water's edge and a little crawfish or crawdad or something tried to snake my worm. Had no idea that kind of creature would be around there, so I spent the next hour trying to, then finally, not easy getting a pinch a guy with a fish line, catching his butt. He was cool, that is all. He was cool. Fishing in a remote lake in northern Ontario, you literally could only access it by the railroad. As we basked in the beauty and seclusion of the area, we thought, I wonder if anybody else has been here. Then I caught someone else's lure. I was fishing for trout in Missouri, near Cassville in the Roaring River, which many people fish it. The water is crystal clear and you can see the bottom. This day I had no luck and was about to leave, but saw a stringer in the water with 3 fish on it that had gotten away, and they weren't gonna make it much longer. So I spent the next 15 minutes snagging the stringer with a hook and pulling it close enough to pull it out the water. I got skunked but still took home some fish. This is going to get buried, but frick it. I was deep sea fishing with family and friends, and we spent hours in the Gulf of Mexico, pulling up moderately sized fish, nothing special. Then, after a while, a family friend got a pretty solid bite. He started reeling, and the rod just about snapped in half. After a few minutes of intense battle, the beast finally broke the surface. Much to our surprise, it was a bolt which had fallen off of a nearby oil rig. Hilarity ensued very much. I've only been fishing a couple times in my life, but when I was a kid, I caught the same tiny bluegill 3 times while nobody else with me caught anything. I got a rock wedged into the hook somehow. Many Charlie Brown jokes were made. Oh, and one time I hooked my dog in the nose. I didn't notice her walk up behind me while casting. I felt horrible. This isn't a fishing story, so feel free to downvote. However, once when I was diving we found a toilet with an octopus living in it. Just randomly there, with no other debris around it. Hilarious. I caught a water moccasin out of a pond as a young boy. It had wrapped itself around a limb in the water, but I had thought my line was just stuck, so I pulled for all I was worth. When it finally loosened, it shot out of the waters like it was on springs right at my face. I pulled my pole back frantically, but line and snake wrapped loops around my head and one prong of the hook embedded in my ear, while less than an inch away the other prong was embedded in the snake's mouth. It was hissing angrily and writhing about my head. Luckily my dad was with me and he used a knife to decapitate the snake and pulled the hook from my ear. Deep sea fishing off the coast of Cape Cod. I caught a skate by the tail. The hook went through the tail. What are the odds? 100%. I went with a buddy and his family on vacation down to Florida a couple years back. His dad is big on making crab cakes and all that, so we went out and bought all the gear for going crabbing in the Everglades. On our way into our spot I had seen a small alligator, maybe 3 ft/1 meter, and immediately started joking about how I wanted to catch a gator. Well, the way we were catching the crabs, we were tying chicken necks to rope, throwing them out into the water and slowly pulling them back towards shore and over a net. When the crab worked its way over the net, swoon, crab. It was working pretty well with 4 of us on the bank in the fur and spots. Well, I felt a little tug on the end of my rope, didn't think anything about it and told my buddy to grab the net. I had one on the line. About the time he turned around with the net, a 7-8 foot gator came straight up out of the water with my rope hanging out of its mouth. Long story short, it put a stop to our crabbing in that area. A scuba diver. Years ago a few friends and I were fishing a river in between 2 different lakes called Burley Falls in Ontario. We weren't having much luck when we noticed what seemed to be like a feeding frenzy near the water surface about 30 feet away. There were bubbles rising up and making a commotion on the water. None of us could figure out what it was and we all started throwing our lures at it. We were doing this for a few minutes when I finally caught onto snagged something. It was heavy and I pulled at it as much as I could. After a full 2 minutes of reeling this thing in, a scuba diver popped up beside the boat and asked if this belonged to one of us and pointed at the lure hooked on his gear. We were more than a little freaked out by the situation and everyone had a good laugh about it, but it wasn't until after that we realized how it could have ended much different if we decided to start the engine. It's certainly the biggest thing I ever caught. Most of my mum's side of the family and my dad worked on a trawler off the northeast coast of Scotland. The weirdest story I can remember at the moment is when they caught some kind of tropical fish from south of equator. How it got to these much colder waters on the other side of the planet without dying en route is a mystery. They put it back in after they identified it. Fishing with my father on a river north of Seattle back in the 80s. I had cast out across the flow of the river and was doing a slow retrieve looking for trout. I snagged onto something that I thought was a log, but then it started slowly pulling on my rod. I was able to make some headway, no pun intended, on retrieving it, but as it got near the bank of the river I could see that I had a freshly severed, fully grown cow's head that had been floating down the river. I threw it back so it could grow some more. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.